Welcome to our nonfiction portion of today's program. As we all know, nonfiction encompasses a broad array of subjects and approaches, and our panel provides some excellent examples of this. So I'd like to introduce you today to Sally Bedell Smith, author of George VI and Elizabeth, The Marriage That Saved the Monarchy by Random House, a division of Penguin Random House. Karen Fine, DVM, The Other Doctor, a veterinarian, explores what animals can teach us about love, life, and mortality, Anchor Books. Brianna Holt, In Our Shoes, on being a young Black woman in not so post-racial America, Plume Publications. Ava Chen, Mott Street, a Chinese-American family story of exclusion and homecoming, by Penguin Press. And Leta McCollough Seletzky, The Kneeling Man, my father's life as a Black spy who witnessed the assassination of Martin Luther King, by Counterpoint Press. So I'd like to get started right away because we have a lot to talk about. And I'd like to start with your approaches to the search for identity that I found in so many of these works, and some of the painful revelations you encountered on your journey. I'd like to start with Ava, because your search came from an attempt to understand a distant father whose absence contributed to the person you became. At one point you say, it's very difficult to forgive someone who expresses absolutely no remorse for their actions. I knew that I would have to reckon with the fact that maybe I would never reach that point where I could truly forgive him. Would you share with us if you were able to find a path to forgiveness, or something more important, or both, when you were writing the book?
Sure. Well, I just thank you, Katherine, for being our moderator. And it really is such a thrill to be here with these amazing writers. So I was raised by a single mother. And my childhood was spent wondering about who my father was and who is this family that I was estranged from. At the same time, I grew up hearing my grandfather's stories about his grandfather, who worked on the nation's first transcontinental railroad. And some of the questions I had was, why did the mail to my grandparents' house come under a different name? Was my grandfather illegal? And was he living here under a false identity? But how could he be illegal when his grandfather built the railroad, that 19th century infrastructure that helped unite the country? So these central questions led me to this story and to major points of interest: the Chinese Exclusion Act laws and their impact on 4 generations of my family in New York's Chinatown, and the single tenement building in the heart of the community, a building where both sides of my family lived and where we have continuously lived for over 100 years. It's where I wrote the majority of this book, and it's also where I'm speaking to you from today. Now, whether or not I found forgiveness in my heart for my father, you'll have to read the book to find out. But know this, that, the quest to understand him led me to Mott Street, which is our root story. And for that, I'll be forever grateful.
Well, that's a lovely way to put it. And what an amazing continuity to be broadcasting from Mott Street. Leta, you also were searching for your father, and you decided that you needed to do this after the birth of your first child. And how do you think that motive affected your approach to his story?
Pardon me. I want to thank you, Kathy, for moderating today. And it's such a pleasure to join these great authors here. And thanks to everyone for watching. Having a child in the picture, what that did was it increased the urgency of my search for my father's story. And it also underscored the story's importance to me personally, because it was one thing for me to bury the many questions that I had about my father when I merely considered myself. And in fact, I had been pretty ambivalent about wanting to know the truth of why my father, Morel McCollough, was on the Lorraine Motel balcony on April 4th, 1968, right after Dr. King had been shot? Why was he working undercover for the Memphis Police Department? Why did he go on to a career at the Central Intelligence Agency? And was there, what were the connections between these facts? And so, for me, it was easy to bury that. But then suddenly there's a child in the picture. And that's his grandchild. And I had to consider whether I wanted to pass down to that child the ambivalence and really, on some level, the dread that I had been feeling about all this to the next generation. And it just felt wrong to me to do that. And so I decided that no matter what I found, that child deserved to know who his grandfather was and what his life meant.
Well, and it was a beautiful story. Both Mott Street and The Kneeling Man are fascinating in that they're memoir, but they also have so much history. I learned so much. I thought my brain was going to explode, particularly with the Chinese American experience, and then all the ins and outs of the being that kind of spy, going undercover, and all the things that were going on that I had no idea they were. And so they were both fascinating. And Karen, yours is different, but it touched me on such a personal level. I'm a huge animal lover. And you offer so many helpful insights into one of the most difficult things that animal lovers have to do, and that's knowing when to say goodbye to an adored pet, which is, if you've had pets, it's the worst. So could you share two of the most important things that you would want us to know about how to know when it's time or how to do it?
Sure. And thank you so much for moderating. And I'm so happy to be here with these wonderful authors. I appreciate it. And so, first of all, it's very, very hard. And a lot of people don't really talk about it, but it can be one of the most painful times in a person's life. And I saw a client last week. This guy came in with his cat. And he started talking about his dog who had died. And he said to me, I lost my parents 3 weeks apart, but losing my dog was harder. And clearly he had kind of said that before in his mind, but I don't think there were that many places where he felt comfortable saying that. Outside of the exam room. So this is what's called a disenfranchised grief. So similar to the grief of, say, having a miscarriage or something like that, there's other disenfranchised griefs that there's really no place in society to talk about it. It's kind of unrecognized. So that's one point. And then the second thing I'd like to say is that the responsibility for making these decisions around euthanasia and quality of life can feel overwhelming to people. And something else that I've seen over and over is that afterwards, when the animal's gone, people look back with hindsight and they regret decisions, even if they felt good about them at the time. And it's like looking back in hindsight with what you now know. And what happens is they feel like they failed their animal, and becomes part of their identity and part of their narrative about their animal's life. And it's just heartbreaking. And it's such a common thing. And I think the main thing is that people need to really trust themselves that they're making the best decisions they can at the time with the information that they have.
And one of the things that your book does is make the connection between the animal world and the human world. And so many of the things that you're touching on here definitely have to do with that transfer. Like you those kinds of skills or comforts you need when you're saying goodbye to a parent, and or in any of those circumstances. So it was very, very helpful. And Sally, I'm switching back to a little bit about identity. You weren't searching for personal identity, but you were dealing with the identity of a nation. And you credit Elizabeth II's successful reign to her upbringing, and as well as the way her father became king. And part of that story includes the Duke of Windsor and his marriage to Wallis Simpson. And Americans have tended to romanticize this story. I remember, I love British history too. And I remember I read a lot of things about that that were very enlightening. Could you share a little bit about that? Sally, you need to unmute, please.
Well, for many, many years, Americans tended to see the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor as a love story. And in some ways, it was a love story, but we know so much more about their relationship that casts the story in a different light. And a lot of it was a revelation to me when I was doing research for this book. Before he met Wallace, the Duke was involved with two other married women. And I have read the letters that he wrote to one of them, Frida Dudley Ward, with whom he had an affair for 14 years. And it was clear that while he was charming in public, in private, he was bored and bitter. He was emotionally immature. He was cynical. He was selfish. He once wrote to Frida that he was the kind of man who needs a certain amount of cruelty. He liked being dominated, and Wallace dominated him. Once during his brief reign as King Edward VIII, one of their friends named Lady Diana Cooper was shocked to watch him get on all fours and pull the hem of Wallace's dress from underneath a chair. And what Diana wrote in her diary was, she stared at him as one might stare at a freak. And she was truly taken aback by Wallace's coldness toward him, and that she even made fun of him. But he was obsessed with Wallace. He admired her abilities as a hostess, her high style, and her lively conversation. She, in turn, craved the money and the prestige, the jewels and the expensive wardrobe that he provided for her. So he gave up the throne for her in 1936, and they did remain married until 1972. But their existence in France, where they actually lived only because they could live without paying taxes, was luxurious, but very superficial. They didn't, to the people who spent time with them, came and visited them, they didn't seem fulfilled or happy. And Prince Charles, in fact, visited them a year before the Duke's death when they were having a party for some American friends. And he wrote in his diary that Wallace was a hard woman, and he described the scene at their house as tragic, the existence, the people, and the atmosphere. So it was a very different story from the one that everybody originally had in mind.
And that's so interesting because of the stories that have continued with in contemporary times with the monarchy. And, you know, I feel like we won't know those stories for many years, the whole story, if ever, which
right.
We don't necessarily
take the time.
Yes. And there were, although classified as memoirs, the works of Brianna and Karen also are infused with lots of factual information and social commentary. Ava's has social commentary too in its historical context. But I wanted to ask Brianna, your story takes on broader political and social issues through the lens of your own experience, which I think is what makes it so compelling. And in your introduction, you explained that your experience is not that of every Black girl or woman, yet telling your story makes your book extremely powerful. Could you share some of the things that were difficult for you to discuss, or you felt like you really had to discuss?
Yeah, for sure. And I first want to say that I'm very grateful to be here today with everyone else involved. So first and foremost, it was difficult to discuss just any of this. I see oftentimes in my own personal experience, in the media and online, that women, but specifically Black women, when we share our truth, it makes people very uncomfortable. It makes people angry. People try to discredit us, label us as complaining, or that we should fix the problem ourselves, or that we should be grateful. But these are the same people who are coming from a place of ignorance and usually don't have the intelligence or education to understand the ways in which systems quite literally harm and kill Black women. These systems affect our health and our well-being. And so it was difficult simply just to be vulnerable and open myself and my lived experience to scrutiny and criticism from people who are more privileged than me, but won't actually take a moment to walk in my shoes. But I think when it comes down to a specific chapter or a specific topic that was difficult for me to discuss is the chapter on colorism. I think there is less collective knowledge across cultures and races and even genders about the real harms caused by colorism. And actually, when I was writing my book, I realized even when typing the word colorism into the Google Doc that I was using at the time, it kept underlining it as if it was misspelled. And I realized that the word isn't even widely recognized in some writing systems. And I think the way that Black women and Black men experience colorism is very different, as well as the way we exert it. And I also think that it can be difficult for a lot of people to accept that although we are all of the same race, we are all Black, that they can hold privilege over other members in their own racial group if their skin is lighter. And so it makes colorism this difficult thing to grapple with because it involves taking accountability for how you either exert it or how it benefits you, and just being honest about those experiences, even though you are still oppressed at the same time.
Yes, I think that was, it's a subtlety that I would say most Caucasian people cannot comprehend the significance of that subtlety. And I'm glad that you talked about it. And Karen, you have a really cool theory, I thought, or sort of, I guess it's a theory, but the idea that we can learn wellness strategies from the animal kingdom. And you were talking about when you had cancer, and you took that same attitude that you had when you had cancer. And the attitude was, you said, the cancer and I went to mediation. Instead of thinking about fighting the cancer, you mediated with it. You know, what can I give? What can from this, and what can I gain? And you took that same approach with your dog when she passed from cancer. Could you expand on this? And I think it's really important that we talk about the clues that we could get to treating some human illnesses by the things we've learned from animals. I just thought that was fascinating.
Sure, thank you. So, from what I've seen in treating animals, is that they respond to medical challenges in many ways much better than we do. And I think because they don't have all the mental gymnastics, so they're not thinking, how am I going to pay for this? Why me? Why did I get it? How can I fight this? What are people going to think about me? How is this going to affect my life? They just kind of act how they feel on any given day. And the first time I saw this was when I was in veterinary school, and there was a little cat who had a broken leg that was unable to be repaired. So she had the leg amputated. And a couple of days after, I took her out of the cage and I put her on the floor to see what she would do. And she sort of just kind of adjusted to her new body, and she wobbled a little bit, and she kind of off she went. And I was just amazed because I thought, I don't think a person would be able to do that. And granted, they walk on four legs, not two, but I still felt like this was just this amazing thing. And then when my dog got cancer, I felt the same way. So she had cancer before I did, and she just didn't really seem phased, and this mass was growing bigger and bigger. And I didn't like to think about a fight going on in her body because her cancer was inextricable from her. It was unable to be removed with surgery. So I didn't want to picture a battle going on. I wanted her and her cancer to agree to disagree. And I felt strongly about that. And then when I got cancer, I felt the same way. And mine was able to be removed surgically, but then I had to have chemo. So with chemo, you're thinking, okay, any rogue cells in the body are going to take this hit. And I kind of felt like I was thinking, okay, any rogue cells out there, you're going to take one for the team. I just didn't want to think about it as a fight analogy. So, and I know other people feel that way, and there's many different ways to think about it, but I feel that being around animals has really helped me a lot. And there's also something, a fairly new discipline called One Health, which looks at the health of people and animals and the environment as all being intertwined. So I think on that level, we can learn a lot from animals, and they're starting to do more and more things, like for instance with dogs getting many of the same types of cancers as people.
And that's especially important now with all the emphasis on trying to control epidemics, pandemics, in anything that we have to use, we should be using it, or at least looking at it. So, and I was so impressed with everyone in the research department here. It was like, I just was amazed. Sally, I read about your research process, and I thought, my goodness, I want to know, first of all, if you could just review it a little for us, but then maybe tell me before that, second of all, that reverse those. Tell me what got you so passionate about this subject, and then tell us a little bit about how you researched it.
Yeah, well, I had first written about the British royal family in the late 1990s, and it was kind of happenstance. Random House, Diana died, and Random House asked me to do a biography of her. The person who called me knew I knew a lot of people in England. And so I said, yes, I will do this. It was literally a few days after she died, and I had to write it in 18 months, and my previous books had taken 5 years apiece. So it was a bit of a challenge. I spent 4 months in England, and my British friends really helped guide me to the best sources. And so I felt I was able to tell Diana's story in a new way. And the book was well received here, and even more importantly, over in England. I then moved on to biographies of the Kennedys and the Clintons, but I leapt at the opportunity to write about Queen Elizabeth II. I had met her once at the British Embassy at a garden party in Washington, D.C., and I had been completely captivated by her unexpectedly animated conversation. She was quite different from what I imagined. So I was determined to show that private side and explain how she fulfilled her role so remarkably well. Again, I traveled to Britain, where I spent 6 months interviewing her friends and family members, and as well as observing the Queen and Prince Philip carrying out their duties in Britain as well as overseas during visits to Bermuda and Trinidad. And then it seemed only natural that I should write a biography of the next king, Prince Charles. And that project followed pretty much the same pattern. 5 months in Britain and trips with the prince's entourage to Sri Lanka and Malta, which I never would have visited otherwise. In all 3 instances, my sources really helped me over and over and introduced me to more people who could help me, who could give me additional insights. And nobody in Buckingham Palace, by the way, had a say in anything that I wrote. But I was told that they felt that I had been fair and thorough. And I do think that that positive view helped me to gain the extensive access that I really needed to fully capture the lives of the Queen's mother and father in a way no biographer had previously done. And I was incredibly grateful to receive the Queen's permission to read her parents' diaries and letters in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. And to get there, I had to climb a steep staircase of 100 medieval stone steps, which I did for 3 months. And for 6 hours a day, I was in very good aerobic shape. For 6 hours a day, I pounded my laptop to record all these private moments that I hope give my book a special intimacy. I was the first person to read the diaries of George VI during World War II and a little bit after in their entirety, since his official biographer had done it in the 1950s. And they were a revelation. They showed his personal growth and his thinking, as well as his shrewd perspective on political and military leaders. And I've written, this is my 8th biography, but I have to say that researching this book was really one of the most thrilling experiences of my career as a biographer.
And I think that really shows in the work, because you bring it, you bring that love to the page, and you bring
Oh,
that
thank you.
information feeling to the reader. So that was remarkable for me too. And Ava, you have a huge time span. You take us from the building of the railroad to the development of Chinatown and culminate with your relationship with your father. I was amazed with all that you included. How did you determine what to include and what not to include? Because I bet you there's twice as much that did not get in the book.
Yeah, so this really was the biggest book of my life in terms of the scope. I never had to deal with so many generations of family members, such a wide time period in American history. So in the beginning, it was really daunting. But what I realized is that at heart, I really needed to understand why my father was the way he was, why he was so distant, and also why the Chinese Exclusion Act laws occurred in the first place. Chinese exclusion happened in the 1882. So the questions were, like for me, were what were the conditions that led to their enactment? That took me to the mid-19th century when the country was asking itself some very pivotal questions, including who is an American and who is not? Who is one of us and who is not? And so this led me straight to Chinese exclusion, which stopped legal Chinese immigration in this country and blocked a pathway towards our citizenship for 61 years. And it also was a watershed moment for our country because it also set the tone for future immigration restrictions going forward against other nationalities. And in many ways, the idea of exclusion was something that I personally had always been confronted by ever since I was a little girl. I realized that exclusion is not just a political condition, but it's also one that can exist within families as well. So I think I'm not sure if I mentioned, but I'm actually a 5th generation Chinese American. And so I'm lucky in the sense that I have lots of family members who lived and worked during all of these major moments in the exclusion era. So I have railroad workers in the family, folks who fled the violence out west in the 1880s and 1890s, and then did a reverse migration across the country to New York, where they became merchants and folks who raised funds for Jewish pogrom victims, civic leaders who banded together and fought exclusion and spoke out against it before Congress. Folks who, once we got here to Mott Street and landed in this building in which I'm sitting, later on became neighbors, classmates, lovers, and sworn enemies. And it was several generations later that eventually, through my own birth, they became family kin. So I was really lucky that I have all of these family members to choose from. And I was really interested in a lot of their stories. So that helped me figure out enormously what to include and what not to include.
And it, like I said, it's a part of our history that I don't feel like I know we don't teach much in high school. I had some experience teaching history in high school, American history, and it's just something I think is very important for us to be aware of. As with you, Leta, I liked the phrasing that you had about the young men who were active in the time of Martin Luther King, when they were kind of discovering things about themselves in the country. And they were filled with a sense of defiance or an air of challenging things. And do you think I feel like your father was affected by this? Can you talk about that a little bit, and how you feel like it might affect your sons?
Pardon, I agree with you. And I believe that he was affected by that very much. And, you know, just to give some context, this was in the mid 1950s to late 1950s in the area around Senatobia, Mississippi, which is in the Mississippi Delta. And this is in the heat of Jim Crow. And like so many other young Black people then, my father, Mac McCollough, is awash in a sea of these conflicting messages about who he is and what his place is in the world. And he's learning, for example, from his family that he comes from respectable people. with an honorable heritage, and they should take pride in that. But then once he leaves his home, he's getting very different messages, some of which intersect with what he's hearing at home, and some of which directly contradict what he's hearing at home. And of course, there's the overt white supremacy from the dominant culture there. But then there's also this message that he's getting from many of the elders in his community that he needs to essentially stay in his place and not step out of line vis-a-vis white people. And they were telling him this for survival, because right around this time, mid-1950s, and not very far away, about 85 miles away in a town called Money, Mississippi, a boy close to my father's age named Emmett Till had just been brutally murdered for this alleged perceived slight. And so the elders are telling him, you have to be very careful in how you're operating in the world, and how you need to be reserved in the way that you move. But at the same time, as you mentioned, there are these young people, there's this sense of defiance coming from young people who have gone to cities like Memphis and other large cities, and then they come back with this air of challenging things. And, they're bringing that back. And so Mac is watching all this. And what he learns is that the community doesn't have to operate the way that it's operating. The world doesn't have to be as he sees it, and that he doesn't need to necessarily flatten himself or cower, and that it's possible for him to transcend the state of affairs that he finds himself in. And one example of how he does, I think, demonstrate that he's internalized this is that he does something rather dangerous, which is that he kind of butts heads with his boss. He's a teenager working on a ranch, and he's got this foreman who is a member of a well-known white supremacist group called the White Citizens Council. And so the foreman thinks that he should be working in the field rather than going to school during the week. And he shouldn't be able to play baseball with his friends on Saturdays. And so Mac challenges that. So I think that shows that he does internalize that sense of defiance. And I think that carries through, as you asked about my sons, that next generation, I think that sense of defiance has only grown. And I think we can see that with movements, not only the United States, like Black Lives Matter, but movements around the world for democracy are showing young people everywhere that the society that they see around themselves doesn't have to necessarily be the way it is, and that they don't need to flatten themselves, and that they can make change.
Great takeaway for the next generations, for the ongoing generations. And Brianna, you take a really close look at the way that our attitudes have affected the actual health of Black women. And I like you do a great job of interweaving statistics. And I think sometimes that's the best way to approach people who just won't hear you. If they're willing to think, statistics might help to just open that door just a little bit. Could you share with us two of the most important statistics you would want us to know, assuming we know very little about it, but we want to think?
Yeah. So while I can't speak for what would be the most important statistics for all Black women, I do think that the stats that reveal the most consistent harm toward us, therefore being extremely important, is one, that Black women are nearly 4 times more likely to experience difficulties and die from childbirth than white and Hispanic women in the US. And compared to other women of color, Black women still have the highest gap. And I just think birth for a child itself is a very early stage for society to decide that their life matters less. I think back to summer of 2020, when you see the signs of all Black Lives Matter, Black trans lives matters, Black children's lives matter from the stages of birth before we even enter this world. And so for this stat to be 4 times more likely to experience difficulties and die from childbirth is just quite literally telling us from the earliest stage that our life matters less. Even with medical advancements in pregnancy and childbirth, that statistic, the percentage itself of 4%, has been the same since my mom gave birth to me in 1995. And we are the only women in America who have not seen that statistic improve at all since I was born and prior. And we've seen how it runs true for even the most celebrated and wealthiest Black women, like Serena Williams and Beyonce, for example. They have both shared their horror stories with pregnancy as Black women. Secondly, I'd say the stat about missing Black girls and women is also quite alarming. In 2020 alone, of the nearly 269,000 girls and women who were reported missing, nearly 34% of them were Black, despite us only making up 15% of the US female population that year. So there's so much to unpack there: why we go missing, why we stay missing, and why there is less attention in finding us by both the media and law enforcement. And why there's also a responsibility that is often placed on us, or blame placed on us and our family members, for why we are missing, as we do not see with other women that when they go missing, there are viral searches online and the internet, people coming together, going and looking for these people. So both of those two stats are tied to the mortality of Black women and girls, and they're fueled by unconscious biases, systemic and medical racism, and a result of living in a society that was founded on white supremacy, which means that Black women have very little control in changing this. And it is the responsibility of those with privilege to not only challenge these systems, but to also challenge their own way of thinking.
Think about how quickly we have the movie of the week about a missing white girl or woman, and we don't have a clue what's going on with non-white missing victims. So I thought that was very, very telling and very interesting. I would also like to ask you, Ava, I'm sorry, we're going to kind of wrap it up, so we'll have to go a little bit quickly. Hopefully we're going to have some time for questions. So Sally, you attribute Queen Elizabeth II's astonishing record of stability and continuity to the careful nurturing of George VI and Elizabeth, her parents. Together, they indeed saved the British monarchy. Could you tell us what you mean by saved the British monarchy? And also, what can we learn? Can we learn anything as a country from this?
Yes, I think we can. I mean, as I've traveled around the country speaking about my various members of the royal family, people have often said, I wish we had something like that. I mean, obviously we don't want to have a king or a queen, but what particularly the queen for 70 years was such a unifying force. And she was called the light above politics. And the inspiration for the stability and continuity provided by her over 70 years came from the example set by her mother and father, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. And it was fascinating for me to know what a strong partnership they had during their nearly 30 years of marriage, and especially during their 15-year reign. The reign of King Edward VIII, who I spoke about earlier, had been a disaster, not only because of his affair with Wallis Simpson, but because he was reckless, he was irresponsible, he failed to sign government documents, he hated taking advice from the government, he refused to keep regular hours. The Foreign Office was so concerned that they began to withhold documents from him. He was very careless. Most alarmingly, he sympathized with Nazi Germany, and he had frequent and lengthy talks with Hitler's ambassador to Britain. And on the day George VI took the throne in 1936 at the age of 40, after his brother's abdication, a cousin asked him what he was going to do. And he said, I don't know, but I'm going to do my best. And he did that and more, winning the loyalty of the people in Britain and the Commonwealth as he and his wife, who was only 36 years old, carried on with decency and diligence. And from their diaries and letters, I could see how hard they worked and how profoundly they understood what the British needed in a leader. And after the coronation in 1937, a member of parliament observed that neither Edward VIII nor Wallace Simpson could have carried out what he described as the solemn dedication which seems so natural and fitting from these two simple and good young people. And then, of course, World War II presented the ultimate challenge to the king and queen, who really rose to greatness with their bravery under fire and their sympathy for the British people who endured years of German bombardments. George Elizabeth repeatedly put their lives at risk, and they inspired not only the British people, but their own daughters, who learned a lot about courage.
And the lesson of doing your best and being proud of doing your best and respecting people for doing their best. I think that's very important. And Ava, you present the image of the Chinese puzzle ball. And you said you were simultaneously the builder as well as the puzzle ball itself. And you realized that you were unlocking and unraveling important elements for you, for your daughter, for your future. Do you think that you would have been able to assume this role if you'd had a very different kind of relationship with your father?
Well, as I mentioned, I really have to thank my father for leading me to this story. And maybe I would not have been asking all these questions if he had remained. I think the puzzle ball is such an interesting metaphor. A puzzle ball is a ball inside a ball inside a ball, and they're made from one single piece of material. They haven't been sawed open and created inside each other. It's just a ball inside a ball inside a ball. And I love the idea of the puzzle ball because it shows us how interconnected we all are. What happens to you impacts me. What impacts me affects you and all of the future generations going forward. It's totally a metaphor for this book, as well as what happened over 150 years ago in this country during the period of Reconstruction, when the country had an opportunity to build anew, but instead entered a period of deep entrenchment. Slavery becomes segregation, and politicians cut deals with each other to enact the first restrictive immigration legislations. And these all paved the way to where we find ourselves today.
That personal connection is so important, and you do a great job of making that in there. I don't want to rush everybody, but I was hoping we might have a little time for questions. But let me ask Karen. You say that that's why we love creatures who will not outlive us, and that's why we put our hearts on the line for them. And loving animals teaches us about being alive. Can you give, other than the way you dealt with your cancer, is there another way in your life that this stands out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like every day I just really interact with my animals and learn from them as well as my patients. So, for instance, if I go for a walk with my two dogs, one of them is like a hound mix, and he's very much, his nose is to the ground and he's sniffing, sniffing, sniffing. And the other dog is very visual, and she is looking around and she's looking for movement. She's looking for squirrels and rabbits and birds. And normally I would probably just be thinking about, what do I have to do? And it's cold out, and what's the weather, and what am I going to cook for dinner again? And, watching them really brings me out of myself and sort of into the moment with them. And then we get home and they cuddle on the couch, and we really have our lives intertwined with each other on a very daily basis with all these little daily routines. And they're often the first faces you see in the morning and the last ones at night. So I just think it's incredible to have these interspecies relationships.
And they always make you feel good. Leta, I hate to rush you, but can you give us 2 aspects of your father's life that you would like for us to remember? Oh, you're muted. I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. 2 things.
So good.
Quick. I want them to know, number one, that their granddaddy Mac valued his good name. And he was brought up to do that, just like I'm bringing up my sons to do that, because a name is a stand-in for so much more. And it's one of the only things in this world that is yours. And at the same time can, to some extent, be passed down as well. Number 2, I want them to know that their granddaddy Mac lived out this wrenching kind of faith that is expressed not merely as taking an action without the assurance of personal benefit, but taking action when your detriment is all but assured. And that kind of faith is the kind of faith that it's taken to fight for the promises of democracy and personal agency in a society that does not necessarily envision those promises for you.
Thank you, Leta. And that goes well to what I was going to ask Brianna, because she talks about how Black women are valid and how they choose to grant themselves grace until others begin granting us grace and take a walk in our shoes. How are you able to grant yourself grace, Brianna?
Yeah, I first just want to say, because Black women in America have entered America as always being expected to work, service others, support the family unit, granting ourselves grace as Black women is a radical act itself. On a personal level, granting myself grace looks like leaving a job that underpays me and refuses to give me a raise instead of thinking and hoping I will move up the corporate ladder. Or it means muting and unfollowing celebrities and influencers who are non-Black, who might use Blackness to boost their personality and their career, but do not center our community or give back to our community in any way. It could look like surrounding myself in Black and brown spaces and with Black and brown folk, so that my energy is just protected. I think all of these things result in less stress for me and a more graceful life.
I think that is I appreciate you putting it that way. And I want to thank all of you today. You have been wonderful. I want to thank the librarians and educators who've joined us. And we're, I believe, going to have an afternoon keynote speaker. But before we go, one more time, I just want to say how delightful it was to get to know you all, how important I think your work was, and how much I learned from it. I need to go back over and look at my notes that I took. And I feel like I'm a smarter and a better educated person. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.